Welcome to Boats and Pros, the podcast where we tackle all things boats and fiberglass repair. Whether you're a seasoned pro or a weekend warrior, we've got the tips to keep your boat in tip-top shape. Let's get into it. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to episode number 6 of Boats and Pros. I'm Nick Ireson.
I'm Johnny Conover.
We're here to waste your time, as usual. Before we get too far into this episode, I want to give a little moment of solidarity to the victims of Hurricane Helene. It's happening right now in real time, and pretty bad scene all over the place. Coast of Florida, Panhandle, all the way in Carolinas, and not a good situation. So we're not going to go too far into that. 'Cause it's not really in our lane, but prayers to everybody who's been affected by that.
Yep, I agree. Especially coming from Fort Myers.
Yeah, no kidding. It's a lot more personal when you're watching it happen to people that you know and love again. You know, these guys just got it back together from Hurricane Ian, and it's just keep on coming, it seems like. But anyway, that's onto a lighter note. Let's get going here with some boat talk. What are we talking about here, John? Tool of the week?
Yeah, let's start with the tool of the week. This is one of my favorites.
I was going to say, I got to let you take this one, dude. You got way more hours on that thing than I do.
So one of my favorite things is the ease of cutting material, mostly the heavy stuff, 4808.
What is our tool? What are we talking about here?
So our tool is going to be the cordless fabric cutter from Harbor Freight. It's a Warrior 4-volt. SKU number is going to be 56192. And it's kind of like a pizza cutter wheel. And it works great in straight lines. Can get a little bound up sometimes, but
On the heavy stuff, though.
On the heavy,
A
yeah.
lot of guys aren't using that kind of heavy stuff.
but
Doesn't work on Kevlar,
does not work on Kevlar.
but not much does.
Works on matte, works on most biacs, any woven.
Real nice clean cut, pretty quick. 40
And-
smackaroos for this thing, so it's not a huge investment.
No, and your hands thank you after 5 minutes.
Yeah, even a nice pair of those Wiss steel scissors, it gets to your hands, even if you keep them sharp. We use our scissors quite a bit in the middle of layups too, and if we don't clean them really well, then you can have a little bit of a battle cutting heavier fabric with them. But I would say, I think this is probably one of the only Harbor Freight tools that we're still on the first one.
Yeah.
And that came up from Florida with me, right?
Yeah, I didn't think about that.
Yeah, so that's 4 years of use on that thing. Semi-regular use. It's not really a heavily used item, but, I mean, you've got some hours on it.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's seen some work.
Yeah, and to look at it or grab it, it really doesn't feel like anything special. It's kind of like a plastic and metal combo little, yeah, it looks like a battery-powered pizza cutter, really, with a hexagon-shaped, no, it's not a hexagon, is it? Whatever has more sides than a hexagon, but, that.
That's shape, yeah. Flat edges.
My high school geometry teacher is rolling over in her inevitable early grave right now.
But you were her favorite.
Yeah. So, good tool, good price. Definitely recommend you trying it if you're going to be prepping a lot of material. It works really well if you have templates. If you're making a part a lot of times and you just lay your template down on the glass. We use cardboard, or sometimes we'll use house siding wrap. Or I've seen guys use like marine vinyl, just nice and thick and durable to make their templates. Or ram board works pretty well. But lay your template down, trace around it with a Sharpie, then cut your glass out with this tool. Definitely saves you a little bit of handwork, I would say.
It does. Definitely. My hands thank you every day.
Does it save you a little handwork, John?
A lot less calluses.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, so now we're going to move on to a topic that someone in the Fiberglass and Composites Tips and Trick Facebook group made a comment about, a topic that we should touch on, and that is the infamous AB expanding foam, the polyurethane liquid foam. I'm sure that most people who are listening to this have played with it or are familiar with it. If not, It's basically the liquid version of the stuff that comes in a great stuff can. That's it's kind of semi-accurate and oversimplification because it's a different density, but that's the closest thing that you'll know it to if you haven't used pour foam before. Okay, so when we're talking about AB foam, it's basically telling us that there's an A side and a B side. It's mixed at a 1-to-1 ratio, and you can buy different densities of foam. And I tried to look this up real quick, but I couldn't find it. I'm pretty sure it's the B side that determines the density, and the A side is always the same. It could be the flip of that, but basically, let's just roll with it and say that it's the B side. You can get a 2 pound, a 4 pound, a 6 pound, an 8 pound, or a 16 pound density B side that you mix with the A side, and that determines basically the final total weight of 1 cubic foot of space. The most commonly used one that I've seen is 2 pound. That's used for flotation and filling in voids, insulation in coolers, things like that. When you get into the heavier density stuff, oftentimes it's either used in a structural application and wrapped in glass, or it might be used for some kind of tooling or plug making, CNCing, or something like that, which I haven't seen, but I could imagine it.
Is there a spec that the Coast Guard requires that you have?
There is a spec that the Coast Guard requires to call it flotation foam. So I don't know exactly what the merits are that they're measuring that on. Probably when we get Richard on here, he could tell me. But there are certain foams that are approved as Coast Guard flotation foams. And if you have the data sheet and the spec sheet for the product, I think when you get tested by your Coast Guard compliance rep, you can present them with a new material. And I believe that there's a way that they can test the foam that you use for compliance, but it's much easier for manufacturers to just use a product that's already on that list. But yes, there is a spec for it.
Cool.
And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that most of the commercially available foams that you would buy from a fiberglass distributor would probably be within that spec. I know that the one FGCI sells, they have it listed on their website as Coast Guard approved.
Okay.
Foam is one of those things that is wonderful and terrible at the same time. It's very easy to underestimate the power that foam creates when it's expanding and the destructive power that it has if you put too much foam into a closed shape or a closed space and don't give it a relief, or you give it a relief but you block it over. A lot of times guys are tempted to cover over the relief hole with their hand to make sure the foam expands in there before the extra comes out. It really depends how thick the fiberglass is that you're working with and the circumstances that you're putting it in, but if you're injecting foam into unsupported fiberglass and there's some open flat spans, I guarantee you those spans are not going to be flat by the time the foam is done expanding. And you could almost say that is whether or not you have the proper relief. Even if you had a good relief hole, if you put too much foam at one time or something like that, or there wasn't enough of a relief, you could still end up blowing the flat sides out of a part. And then sometimes after it cures, you end up sucking those flat sides back in, or sometimes a little bit of both, and you end up with this crazy looking mountain range kind of side profile when you catch it in just the right light.
Did you ever see the movie The Blob?
I did.
Kind of
Yeah.
reminds me of that.
Yeah, when the foam is expanding up out of your relief hole and you're wondering when it's going to stop. Basically, just like everything else that we talk about, one of the keys to success with using this expanding foam is your preparation, your anticipation of the things that could go wrong, and your effort ahead of time to have a contingency plan if that thing does go wrong. So you already know you're going to have a giant mess on your hands, so you can plan to clean up ahead of time. This foam dissolves in acetone really well. If you poured acetone into the bucket and all the remaining foam that was reacting inside the bucket would be neutralized, and you can swish it around or clean it with a rag and then dump that out into whatever method you're using to dispose of your acetone, which is a whole another discussion. You can use your bucket over and over again, as opposed to just letting the extra that you don't pour out expand, and now your bucket's done. I use a lot of gallon jugs. My family uses gallon jugs of water for our coffee, and we have two young kids. We fly through milk. So every single gallon jug that we use, if it's milk, I rinse it as soon as we're done with it. And I take those up to the shop, I cut them in half, and I use the bottom half of those for a lot of things. So smaller batches, I might use one of those, and if that's the case, I'm not cleaning that. But if I'm doing a big foaming where I have to use a mechanical mixer and a 5 gallon bucket, we're gonna try to clean that bucket. Those suckers are like $5 a piece these days. So you want to have your acetone on hand so you can clean up, and you want to make sure that you're going to protect everything you don't want foam on, because this is the epitome of going into battle once you start with your foam. It's on like Donkey Kong. As soon as you mix that first batch, you better have a good plan, and you better hope that everything goes according to plan, because if you get off plan and you start flying by the seat of your pants, it's really easy to do something dumb. There's kind of two methodologies when you're applying this stuff. This is all with the assumption that we're talking about applying it to a closed space. If you're putting it into a wide open space, like let's say that you've got your hole and you just laid new stringers in it, and you wanted to foam all the empty compartments around your stringers that you're not using for storage before you were to install the deck, there's not too much that can really go wrong there. It's wide open on top. You're going to mix batches of foam, pour it in there, let it expand, keep topping it up until you have as much as you want. Then you can come back and cut it or grind it flush, and you're off to the races. So, very unusual, really, to run into problems when you're doing that kind of foaming. Kind of foaming that gets you is, let's say you've got open spaces between your stringers and you drop the deck down and then decide, hey, I'm going to come back and add some foam under my deck. Or I'm going to make hollow stringers and then fill them with expanding foam. And it's a situation where there's a guaranteed quantifiable number of foam that is needed to fill a already predetermined void.
Yeah.
Yeah. And those are the situations where you're left, or you're thinking about how you're going to do it, and there's basically two mindsets. You can either say, I'm going to put definitely more in there than I know I'm going to need, and I'm going to let the extra come out, and then I'm going to, cut the extra off, or, pull it. It'll be like a big mushroom on top of whatever your relief hole is at that point, provided your relief hole is big enough to relieve the pressure of the foam before it blows your hole downwards or separates it from the stringers. That sounds kind of extreme, but it's possible if you were to vastly mismeasure your foam. So then the second mindset would be to say, I'm going to do a series of small pours where there's no chance that this thing goes off the rails, but it might take a little longer, it might cost a little bit more in consumables, and there is a higher possibility that I might be left with some voids within the compartment that are not entirely foamed. And so if you're facing a foaming project and you're on the crossroads of which of those two ways to go, I strongly recommend that you take the road of caution. Because unless you really, really, really need for every square inch of that void to be filled with foam and not air, let's say like a coffin box coolers we make, for example, we want that to be all foam. But if you're foaming under your deck for some flotation and a little bit of sound deadening and what have you, it doesn't matter if there's a little bit of a gap, right? It doesn't matter if there's a few square inches or even, a half a cubic foot of airspace between the deck and the foam. It's nice if you get it all full and you do a nice clean job and you know that it just a little bit extra came out and everything was happy. But the alternative to having a little bit of an air gap above your foam and below your deck is that you just blow the deck off or flex the side of the hull out. And that there's very few moments in boat building that are comparable to when you've just dropped a hot batch of foam in a hole and you see it start going and you start hearing the glass creak and moan and crack and crackle, and you're just wondering, what have I done? Did I just ruin this whole thing? And sometimes it's just the normal process of the foam expanding and applying a little pressure here and there, and everything's fine. And sometimes you absolutely F some shit up. So some of those lessons you have to learn the hard way, I guess. But if I could save you one lesson from learning the hard way, it would be in the foam game, right, John?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That is, it's one little mistake can cost you 6 hours.
Yeah, a mismeasure of 20 or 30 ounces, especially, or I mean, it could take way more than 6 hours. You could potentially go back to square one on on a rebuild if you just really had a catastrophic foaming incident. And it's I don't know scientifically if it's exactly the same. Maybe someone will correct me, but I liken the power of foam to like a hydraulic power. It just seems so strong and unstoppable. Now there are ways that you can support your part before you foam it so that you don't have major blowouts. But the safest thing to do is foam in small batches. If you find yourself in a circumstance where you just absolutely have to make sure the entire cavity is full to the point where it's bubbling outwards and then you're going to glass over it afterwards, then make multiple relief holes and consider the areas where you think the foam might struggle to escape or struggle to reach. And if your relief hole doesn't have foam coming out of it when your initial batch is done expanding, then you can add some more through the relief hole that didn't have any foam coming out of it. So it just gives you more accessibility, provided you do a good job glassing those holes up afterwards. I usually like to use a hole saw on a drill and a 2 inch or something like that, inch and a half, 2 inch, nothing crazy, but big enough that you have to be able to pour into it. It's usually I like to mix my foam mechanically if I can with a drill and a mixer for at least 45 seconds, and then you're basically running to get it where it's got to go and get it poured before it starts to expand. It can be really tempting to take a funnel or something like that and put it in your hole so it directs the liquid foam down into the hole when you're trying to pour it versus saying pour that foam freehand from a foot or two away straight into the hole. This is based on the assumption that your hole is on a horizontal plane. If it's not, you're gonna that's a whole nother category. You're gonna struggle. You need to figure out how to be able to. So otherwise, we're talking about pretty much injecting. So assuming that you're pouring downwards into the hole, if you put a funnel into that hole, what actually is going to happen is as soon as you don't shoot straight through the hole, and as soon as a little bit of foam touches one of the edges of that funnel down towards the neck, it's going to start expanding outwards. And eventually, it's going to catch a little more foam and a little more foam. And before you know it, your funnel is filled with liquidy, slowly expanding foam, and you're not able to pour the rest of your still liquid foam down into the hole. Hopefully, you're still following me here.
Pretty much like your sink drain getting clogged up with your girlfriend's hair.
Kind of, but yeah, I guess. I guess. Yeah, it's like when you have something around the hole for the foam to touch and start expanding on, then your hole starts rapidly getting smaller. Whereas if you're just trying to shoot straight through the hole, then worst case you either miss to the outside and you just have a mess to clean up, or hopefully you planned ahead and you've masked that whole area and you can just wipe it off with your hand, or it's expanding off to the side, but your hole hasn't actually changed size. So when you have vertical walls, like a funnel creates going into the hole, then that allows the foam to grab that and expand inwards. But if your walls around the hole are all horizontal, then there's no way for that hole to get smaller and smaller as the foam going in expands. So what happens if you use a funnel is you don't get the whole batch poured in like you think you do. I'm talking about a circumstance where you took the time to calculate the volume and measure the foam based on the expansion rate of it and doing your best estimate to fill a void in its entirety with minimal excess. Of course, you want to add a few percentage points to let some foam expand outwards, right? Because you didn't fill the whole void if you don't get a little bit out. But realistically, what we're talking about there is exactly what I'm recommending that you don't try to do, which is fill the entire void in one shot. But if you are going to, don't use a funnel. Fair?
Yeah. Yeah. You would, I guess, what I took away from that was it's a lot easier to pour foam, I guess, down a waterfall than through a garden hose. because by the time the foam gets to the end of the garden hose, it's already expanded and filled it. And
Imagine trying to pour into a traffic cone versus into a 5 gallon bucket lid. I think we're just doing ridiculous references at this point for the sake of it. But basically, the neck of the funnel starts to get narrower. It gets a narrowing of the urethra, as Hank Hill would say, and it creates problems delivering the entire hot batch. Okay, so I don't want anyone to take these numbers and just use them as Bible and blow your boat up and then email me telling me that I'm a horrible person. I am just going to give some rough information here that can be found on the internet that could tell you approximately what to expect from the expansion rate of a liquid volume of foam. Before we get into that, I just want to say that I have seen different expansion rates come from the same amount of foam in the past. I don't know if that was affected by the humidity and the ambient conditions, or the amount of time it was mixed, or the age of the foam, or any combination of those factors. But in my personal experience, the results that you get with, let's just say, 20 ounces of foam, 10 ounces of A side, and 10 ounces of B side, if you were to replicate that same experiment in various different circumstances, you might get various different results. That's been my personal experience. But let's say that you've figured out the volume of the cavity that you want to fill. Basically, what you can do is break it down into cubic inches when you're done. And so you're going to figure out roughly the dimensions. There's tons of ways you can calculate the volume of a space once you have the dimensions. So we're not going to get into all that. But basically, once you have the dimensions, you can break it down, and 1 cubic inch will be a half ounce of foam, basically. So in theory, 1 cubic foot of space, if we want to make it easier, would take 38 to 40 ounces of total liquid foam. So that would be 20 ounces of A side, 20 ounces of B side, give or take, would fill 1 cubic foot. So you can use that going forward if you want to approximate the amount of foam you're going to need. I like to add 10% of whatever I think I'm going to need with the allowance of proper relief holes so that that extra 10% can come out a little bit. But I also like to compress the foam a little bit as it's going in the coffin boxes. So in that situation, I know the foam's not going to be strong enough to blow the mold and the jig apart. So I can put a little more pressure on that than you would in most other foaming circumstances. So when I do that, sometimes I will actually put my hand over that relief hole for the first couple of seconds it starts coming out to really make sure that the foam that's in the compartment presses outwards into all the nooks and crannies and gets, maybe instead of 2 pound density, I'm getting 2.2 pounds or something silly like that. It's not a huge difference, but it's just enough to make sure that it's all nice and tight in there. But I don't recommend that you do that on something without playing with it first and having it well supported and all those other disclaimers. But the takeaway from that, roughly 38 to 40 ounces of liquid foam total, that's the combined two sides, will give you 1 cubic foot of volume.
makes sense. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, so what else can I use, you ask me? Well, if you don't want to play the AB expanding foam game,
What else can you use?
I'm so glad you asked, John. Let me tell you all about it.
Thank you.
Instead of using 2-part expanding polyurethane foam, you can use polystyrene foam. So think the foam that comes in packages that is molded around the shape of your package, not the stuff that's in the bags.
Not peanuts?
Not peanuts. Well, no, they're not made for polystyrene. The kind of foam that they make the like $4 coolers, which are probably like 14 now at gas stations, the disposable coolers, and you can see the little balls of each individual little cell of foam.
That say the gas station's name on them?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yep.
Circle K.
I was thinking 7-Eleven.
Yeah.
Yep.
Maybe that too. And if you get lucky, you can get a few uses out of those things. But there's definitely been many soldiers that have been retired on their first battle there too, I think. But so that is polystyrene foam. Polystyrene foam, like every other material we use, comes with a set of pros and cons. The pros of it are that it's fairly readily available. Usually, foam suppliers will sell it to you in blocks that are 6 inches thick or sometimes a foot thick. You may be able to just Google foam supplier, or you may have to look at like architectural foam or something like that. But it's mostly CNC cut into like decorative pillars and stuff that go on the front of buildings. You can buy some of that polystyrene foam and you can cut it to the shape that you need it. You can make bigger blocks by stacking layers together and gluing them together. I think there's a variety of glues you can use. Super 77 spray adhesive would be one. Liquid nails, I'm sure, would probably work just fine. Might even be able to get away with Elmer's or wood glue. I haven't tried either of those. Personally, I'm a big fan of the old, what am I going to say?
Contractor?
Hot glue gun.
Oh,
Hot glue gun is what we were looking for there, John. You can use the hot glue gun, but basically you can create and carve and shape blocks of foam that you would set into place rather than pour into place. And the benefit of that is that, of course, it's pretty much impossible to blow anything out by doing that. The downside to that is that you can't just fiberglass directly over it if you're using polyester resin. The styrene in the resin reacts with the styrene in the polystyrene and it melts it. Basically, the same thing that happens if gasoline hits it, which I don't believe gasoline has any styrene, but it has something this stuff doesn't like. So if you're going to use it in a situation where you want to glass over it after the fact, then you're going to have to find a way to protect the foam from exposure to the resin. So you could cover it with a layer of plastic, or you could do some masking tape, or ideally you would avoid that situation. One way you could avoid that situation if you were really wanting to use polystyrene foam would be to use epoxy resin. If you wanted to, you could probably just brush, and I haven't done this, I'm just kind of spitballing, might be able to brush a layer of epoxy resin onto the foam to seal it from the poly, and then lay up your poly glass over that. And even though it's not going to make a cross-linked bond between the poly and the epoxy, it's going to bond as much as it would have to the foam.
do you think you could lay some like 6 mil sheeting down?
Yeah. I think if you did it in a way where you did a good enough job and you sealed the edges with some tape and like really took your time and made a barrier, then yeah, you could.
Okay.
Shoot, I don't know. You might be able to brush over it with some latex house paint and just make a barrier coat over it. You know, we're getting into experimental DIY territory here, guys. So all these things that we're talking about are ideas that I haven't tried, but I wouldn't hesitate to try, especially, everything that we put into the try category, we always do a test piece or a test panel first. You're not going to commit to a whole plan of, oh, yeah, we're going to wrap all this foam in 6 mil plastic sheeting and tape the edges, and it's not going to melt it in critical areas. You would experiment with that first on a smaller scale, right? Just like we do.
Oh yeah. Now I wonder if there's a listener out there who could actually educate us on that.
I think that that's a prime example of there being 100 different ways to skin that cat. When we get George on here, I'm sure he'll tell us more specifically about it. But I do believe that our good friends over there at Hawkeye offer a product called Styro Shield, and it is a spray-on primer that protects your polystyrene foam from the styrene in your resin. So this is not a new problem. This is not a problem without a solution or 10. This is just one of the things that you would want to know before you chose the materials for your task.
Yeah, I've made the mistake of trying to make a little resin in a styrofoam cup, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah, it'll just go right through the bottom of that cup pretty quickly.
And on your shoe.
Yeah. Oh, let's talk about how we foamed the coffin boxes just for a minute. Because
what was the black foam Ed used?
we're gonna have to beep out his name, which is gonna make him sound like Bruce Wayne, and he's not at all. I do not know what the name of that product was, but it looked like a black version of polystyrene with a larger balls.
A little thicker.
Yeah, these were bigger, blacker balls.
B. BBB.
Yeah, it was the triple B foam. Yeah. So, oh yeah, let's talk about how we foam the coffin boxes. So the coffin boxes that we make, one of the largest hoops that we have to jump through and problems that we have to solve is how to insulate these things where they are fully insulated, but they don't explode from the foam going into them. And we can't use sheet foam and cut it and trim it because it would just, there's no way. The two shells get joined together, and then we drill a hole in the top lip and pour the foam into it once the shells are already bonded and cured. And the outer shell remains in the mold that it was made in, and the inner shell remains in the mold that it was made in. And the molds have holes drilled in strategic places, and you drop the inner shell into the outer shell with them both still in the mold. And we have these steel bars that go across them, and they basically already have holes pre-drilled in all the right places, and we use the same bolts every time. And it's essentially a mounting jig to align the positioning of the inner shell and the outer shell together. And we have our internal flange that bonds them. And then when that adhesive cures, we come back and with everything still supported within the molds, and these are thick molds. I mean, the coffin box outer shell has to be every bit of 5/8 of pure glass, 5/8 of an inch, and the inner shell is reinforced by Kusa and core mat, and we didn't know exactly how thick they had to be to withstand the expansion force of the foam, but we knew how thick we were going to make them. I think an engineer probably would have told us we didn't need to go that thick, but when you're not that smart, you got to spend a little more on materials, and so that's what we did. And basically, they stay in this encapsulated shell inside and out, and clamped down with metal bars and 3/8 bolts. And then we freehand pour the foam into a 1 inch opening. In that circumstance, it's a very tricky pour that we've had to trial and error, and that is a pour where we do no relief holes, and we have calculated the volume of the foam, and we have some very strong jigs that the part is contained in, and we basically, I don't want to say roll the dice because that's not exactly the right term, but we put a little bit more foam than we need, and I do put my hand over that hole and kind of meter the overflow at first to make sure it really fills in all the voids, and then I let it flow out a little bit, and you can hear it creak and groan every single time. And every single time it makes me think to myself, did I just ruin this? Did I just ruin my molds? Did I just ruin this customer's box? And it's always fine because it's jigged together and bolted together, and it's within this 5/8 thick fiberglass shell. So you can get away with doing things like that with a little bit of trial and error and luck, but that is not the way or the mindset that you want to approach your first foaming project. And after your first foaming project, you'll realize why. We're going to try a little bit of something new here. We're going to roll over to the Facebook group, Fiberglass and Composites, Tips and Tricks. And we have pre-selected a question from my boy, Bobby Nicolopoulos. I practiced that name a bunch of times. Bobby looks and seems from his Facebook profile like he is so Greek that Saganaki cheese flies out of his nose when he sneezes. I'm just going to say that real quick.
You know I'm Greek, right?
Yeah, I've seen the way you look at goats. I know you're Greek.
Thank you.
Okay, so Bobby writes, "Hi all, thanks for accepting the request to join. I'm touching fiberglass for the first time. I have a 1973 Formula boat. I'm glassing in a new deck. I'm thinking for some practice to work on glassing a giant hat first. Going to use a 4-foot beach ball as support. I wonder what's the best way to approach it. I want to create a mold for this hat as well. I would love to hear from the experts." Okay, so right off rip, this is a seemingly well-meaning but ridiculous question, and for that reason alone, I love it. Right? This screams John all over it, like, right?
Yeah.
This is something that you could walk into the shop and be like, "Hey, I need a 4-foot tall cowboy hat immediately."
No, first of all, I would bring the cowboy hat and I would just say, I need some resin because that's the kind of person I am.
That's true. That's true. So, just for the heck of it and the good-natured spirit that this post was made, we're going to play along, and we're going to talk for a few minutes about how we might make a giant fiberglass hat using a 4 foot beach ball as the what I can only assume the top head portion of the hat. Right? Is that how you read it?
Uh, yeah, I was thinking like halfway down. I'm guessing.
Yeah. So we're going to take that 4 foot ball and immediately take the diameter of it and call it a 2 foot ball, right? Because we want the widest point of the hat to be the bottom of it. So essentially, take a sphere and cut it in half, and the hemisphere would be what I'm assuming Bobby Nicolopoulos here is talking about.
So I'm gonna take a stab at this one, and
Stab it.
it's gonna be crazy. I'm gonna get a 4x8 sheet of melamine. And I'm gonna make my. It'll be a 4 foot diameter, right?
It would.
Wood. So pretty much just make a big old hole in the middle. Drop that ball down. Take from my center piece that I cut out. I'm gonna cut that in half so I can extend out where the ball's gonna go, so I can get a flange. Drop that ball down in the middle of that hole. Cover it with some PVA. Spray my gel coat, and then do some chop strand mat over top of it to get my skin coat.
Yeah, I would say you're not too far off base there. I think I would be doing something similar. Before we get too far into this, I have to ask what style of hat you're going to be making when you do that.
10 gallon.
A 10 gallon hat. Does that have a flat brim on it?
Yeah, maybe more like a Raiden hat, but not
Okay,
so
but
pointed.
rounded on the top.
It's for a giant.
I'm thinking that I'm gonna make mine as more of like a you were kind of talking about like a Panama Jack hat, really, right? Like a flat brim around it,
Yeah.
almost like a English World War II army helmet.
Yes. Yes. Very similar.
Yeah. So I'm gonna take it one step further, and I'm gonna say that I'm gonna make mine like a cowboy hat. I'm gonna take a 4x8 sheet of MDF. I'm gonna slice it into. See, the ball is 4 feet across. That's a big ball. It's a big ball, Bobby.
Bobby's got balls.
So that means that we need 4 feet, then we need 2 feet of height in addition to whatever we're going to get out of it.
I like this segment. It's got us thinking.
I'm going to need 2 sheets of MDF for what I'm doing. We didn't talk about a material budget, so I'm splurging for 2 sheets of MDF. And I'm going to cut them hot dog down the center. So now I have 4 2 foot by 8 foot sheets of MDF.
Break out your checkbook, Bobby.
Hang on, hang on. Then I'm going to take those 4 2 foot by 8 foot sheets of MDF, and I'm going to draw another line down the center hot dog of 1 foot. So now my 2x8 MDF has a line down the center with 1x8 on either side of it. And then I'm going to put a mark at 1 foot from each end. So I have a 6 foot line in the middle of it, and I'm going to use a 5 gallon bucket lid to make a radius coming upwards, which is like a 6 inch or so radius. I'm going to use the wide end of the bucket, and then I'm going to cut that shape out of it. So now I have what looks like a trough shape cut into my one piece of MDF. Then I'm going to use a flush trim router and match the other 3 pieces to it. I'm going to take some 2x4s, and I'm going to jig them all up vertically, spaced evenly from each other, about 2 feet in between each one. And I'm going to lay some furring strips across. I might even recess the furring strips into the MDF. Then I'm going to take a piece of masonite, and I'm going to lay it down inside this curved shape. And then I'm going to cut my 4 foot hole out of the center of that, and I'm going to drop the ball into it. And what that's going to leave me with is a ball surrounded by masonite that's going straight out front and back and curving upwards around the sides, cowboy hat shape. I'm going to clay that radius, and then I'm going to follow your procedure, PVA, gel, and skin. And then I'll build out my thickness from there, probably with 2 more layups of 1.5 ounces or 1 layer of 3 ounce.
Well, Bobby,
What do you think about that, Bobby Lopopopoulos?
Bobby, that is our response to your question on Facebook and composites tip and tricks.
And if anybody else wants to add something to that, go on there and comment. I'll see you there. And I'll argue with you about it like Facebook would want us to do.
So,
Scroll
pretty
down.
much what we just made was a dirty mold, right?
You dirty dog. That was the cleanest segue ever, John. Purely by coincidence, our next discussion is on dirty molds, one of my favorite things to do. Dirty molds are exactly what they sound like. It's a mold that is made quick and dirty. It's a one-time use or maybe a two-time use, or depending on how you build it, you might be able to get dozens of pulls out of it, like the molds that we made for beep, which we currently lay out test panels for on a regular basis, which is why I can't tell you their name because I don't think they'd appreciate it. But all you really need to make a dirty mold is some creativity, some melamine or masonite, some clay, maybe a little bit of galvanized flashing. You can use aluminum tape. You can use cardboard. You can break out the hot glue gun, Bondo. There are really no rules in this game. It is literally what materials can you use to make the shape you need for a mold, the inverse shape of whatever you want your finished part to be, with a smooth enough surface that you can at least wax it or spray PVA on it or some variation of both and pop apart. The tools you're going to want to use for this, melamine is my favorite. So I'm really only making dirty molds on 4 foot tall cowboy hats or geometric shapes, hatch lids, battery boxes, battery trays. I'm doing one right now, which I'm actually making a video for a swim platform off the back of the old houseboat that we've been working on. Test panels for beep. Who else? What else? Tell me, do it now. I did one for a hardtop once. It's really just anything where you can't justify the time and expense in making a proper fiberglass mold because you only need it for a couple of times or one time, and you're going to finish the part afterwards anyway. That's one of the biggest things about dirty molds. If you really take your time and you really plan it well, you could gel coat your dirty mold thick enough that you could sand through any of the clay lines or radiuses or imperfections. Maybe. But realistically, this is ideal for a part that you're willing to post finish anyway, which I've never really heard anyone say that term, but it's, I guess, something I made up in my own little world. Post finish to me means once it comes out of the mold, you still have to body work it and paint it or gel coat it. So if that's the case, then a dirty mold is perfect because you're going to have little imperfections here and there. You can fill over them with some icing or glaze and spray it, finish it up however you prefer, and send it on down the line.
You want to know sorry,
What?
my favorite thing?
Cat got your tongue?
My favorite thing about a dirty mold is the price.
Yeah. Very, very cheap in comparison to a real mold. I mean, Masonite's maybe $20 a sheet. Melamine's around $50 a sheet. It's pennies in comparison to the alternative. So I would say that dirty molds are often used for simple shapes. Ironically, they can also be used for complex shapes. One of the nicest things about a dirty mold is that you can disassemble it around the part, one piece at a time. And that's not something you can do with a traditional fiberglass mold. So what does this mean to you? Well, it allows you to play outside the rules. You don't have to have the proper draft angles anymore. You can have negative draft on certain pieces. You can have positive and negative draft at the same time. You can have compound and convex curves. You can do whatever your carpentry and creativity skills allow because you can take the mold apart around the piece until eventually you're just left with whatever piece you made out of it. So, what do you think about that?
So, could you theoretically make a dirty mold out of nothing but modeling clay?
Yes. If you were able to gel coat the mold and be gentle enough when skinning it that you didn't push through the gel coat into the modeling clay, you could. You could make a dirty mold out of a dirty mold.
Word.
Tools that you might need for making this dirty mold: tin snips, if you're using galvanized flashing anywhere. If you watch my video that is soon to follow, you'll see where I used it. Table saw or circular saw, or both. Jigsaw also never hurts. Straight edge, pencil, screws, impact gun, and drill. Hot glue gun, spray gun for PVA or wax. A radius tool for your clay, which will be found on Amazon, and they're often labeled as baker's radius tools or baker's cake decorating tools. They're little sticks with different sized balls on each end, and you drag the ball through the clay to make a uniform radius within it when you apply it into the corner. See my video for more details on that.
What I also like to use is a 1/4 inch extension, about 3 inches, and you put like a quarter inch drive on there.
Yep. Well, the nice thing about using sockets is that you have them usually around close by, and you can pick your size. A lot of times, a radius tool kit that you buy comes with various different sizes, and so that's a nice option to have. Because you really don't want to use a radius smaller than the radius on your smallest bubble buster, right?
Yes.
Because if not, you won't be able to push the glass all the way into that radius because it will be too small for your bubble buster.
Oh, I see. Okay. Too big buster, too small radius.
That's it. You get that
Gotcha.
gap in the edge, then that gel's you're gonna have voids. It's gonna break all down that edge, and then you're gonna be doing a bunch of post finishing. We not like this. That covers the basics of a dirty mold, I think. Really, I love the name dirty mold because that's exactly what it is. There are no rules in this game. If you can figure it out, if you can use a cereal box and some aluminum tape and a hot glue gun and some clay and a couple of zip ties and an old beer can and pull it off, that's what I'm talking about. That's that MacGyver glassing, boy.
I challenge you.
What do you want?
That.
Well, that's just the materials. What do you want me to make you with them?
Well, that's part of the challenge. Who's more creative? We're gonna have to go back.
I'm making a Bitcoin with them.
Well,
Or not. I don't know. Maybe I'll make a beer holder. We apologize that we missed last week. I would like to tell you that we had a really, really legitimate reason for it, but the truth is my wife dragged me to a Morgan Wallen concert, and we went to it.
I slept.
It was pretty fun, I'm not going to lie. I didn't really know any of the songs, but it could have been worse. It could have been Taylor Swift. Okay, I think that I don't think we need to say any more. Yeah. God bless you, everybody. Come back next week, hopefully. I will be out of town next week, so we're going to record one before I go, hopefully. Maybe it'll be a little shorty, like John.
Rude. All right.
Adios.